Welcome back, everybody, to Justin Godsey TV. As tonight, guys, I am recapping UFC on Fox 12, the top 3 matches on the main card, which will be here on my second matchup. We're here looking at Anthony "Rumble" Johnson versus Antônio Rogério Nogueira, aka Lil Nog. This was a very dominating fight from start to finish. The match only lasted, or the bout, I keep on saying match for some reason, but the bout only lasted 44 seconds with Anthony "Rumble" Johnson taking the victory over Lil Nog. Now, this is a stepping up to be one of the greatest comebacks in UFC history, I would love to say, because I am such a big fan of Anthony "Rumble" Johnson. It's not like he had a bad career in MMA. It's just he had a very hard time in his first run in the UFC, cutting the weight. But since then, he's came back to the UFC and is on a roll. And you know what? Making a big example of Antônio Rogério Nogueira, who's had, the Nogueira brothers in whole are just, legacy here, in mixed martial arts as a whole. They developed and worked with a lot of the much younger talent, the much rising talent, as well as the veterans around mixed martial arts today. Now, Rumble Johnson, after, he had his run in the UFC, his recent loss, in his first run was to Vitor Belfort. Once again, he missed out on the weight, but after that, he was let go by the UFC. He went on to fight for Titan FC, Extreme Fight Night 9, against Jake Rosholt. And then from there, he debuted for World Series of Fighting, where he competed at the first 2 events, UFC World Series of Fighting 8 as well, and then making his return back to the UFC at UFC 172, where he defeated Phil Davis via a unanimous decision. I was saying that, Anthony Johnson coming back to the UFC will be a great turnaround in his career. I think now that, he's back in the UFC, I think, we're going to see a much more mature side of him. We're going to see a whole new kind of Anthony "Rumble" Johnson that we have never seen before. Once he was fighting at World Series of Fighting, he's had some great fights. Look back at the fight against Andrei Arlovski. It was a heavyweight fight. World Series of Fighting was able to work with him. Whether is it going to be a heavyweight fight, is it going to be a light heavyweight fight? They were able to work with him. But now that he has more discipline and how important it is to cut weight at the next level, the Super Bowl of all MMA promotions, the UFC. The UFC wanted to bring him back. He has turned things around in a whole new way. So when he resigned with the UFC, defeating Phil Davis, it's just, that next step in his career on, what kind of path is he going to take? Is the UFC going to start him out easy? No, he should always pick up where he last left off. You look at his last couple of fights in the UFC before he was, let go. Vitor Belfort, he lost that via, he was choked out by Vitor at UFC 142. Charlie Brenneman, that was a pretty easy matchup for him. And then Dan the Outlaw Hardy, I hope he gets back in the octagon soon. But, these are some top-ranked opponents. From there, he faced off against, mid-carders, before, ending up in World Series of Fighting, where he faced off against, Mike Kyle and Andrei Arlovski. So, the UFC putting him back into, throwing him back into, the lion's den there and having him face off against a top competitor in Phil Davis. And, most recently tonight, he easily made an example out of Antônio Rogério Nogueira. As much as I hate to say it, but that's just how this bout went. Anthony "Rumble" Johnson, he knocked him out 44 seconds into the fight. This is a whole new ruthless side to Anthony Johnson, that he's really coming for that light heavyweight championship. Now, not only is he 2-0 since his return to the UFC, looking into the future, I can really see a pretty bright, a very exciting matchup that I would love to see here in December at the Phoenix card. That's going to be in my backyard. If this match, if the UFC can come together and put that fight together, I would love to see Glover Teixeira versus Anthony "Rumble" Johnson headlining that Phoenix card. I know it's just UFC on Fox card, but the UFC does get a lot of views on their Fox cards. Since the first Fox card with Dos Santos and Cain Velasquez, the Fox cards have always been the UFC's best friend. We've been seeing the best fights on the Fox cards than anything else, better than the Fight Night cards. So they got to put on something, some highlight at the end of the entire year, the 2014, the very successful 2014 year for the UFC, and put in a barn burn, a blockbuster fight. Now, I would love to hear, I would love to see Anthony Johnson, who's the 5th ranked light heavyweight in the UFC, taking on the number 4, lightweight in the UFC, and Glover Teixeira. I would also would love to see, Rashad Evans, but he's still, recuperating from his injury, but the next guy in line will be Glover Teixeira, because Daniel Cormier is going to be filling in for the injured Alexander Gustafsson, and I don't think that Gustafsson will be back. Hopefully he could be back, but Gustafsson will have to end up fighting once again, because he cannot have this completely long layoff for almost the rest of 2014, because if he's not competing against, John Jones in September, then John Jones is going to have to recuperate, about a month or so before he starts signing up for another contract. So, it's still a big, cluster issue there up at the top of the division. But Anthony Rumble Johnson versus Glover Teixeira will be an interesting matchup going forward. As for Antonio Rogério Nogueira, he is not currently ranked in the UFC rankings. I don't know what to really expect from him. As much as, I really do respect the Nogueira brothers, one of the greatest families in the UFC, a very great developing, situation with them, work with the much younger, talent. At 38 years old, you can't really, do much right now because you're out of the rankings. Your chances of being once, a competitor for, the UFC, lightweight or light heavyweight, belt, it's starting to take a big, turnaround. I really liked that, that 2-fight winning streak going into it, but he has not been an active competitor in the UFC since, early day 2010, 2009. His last fight was last year in February, so, he's taken a huge chunk of his time off. His last, he was on a 2-fight winning streak against him and Tito Ortiz back at UFC 140. Back in 2011, that was 3 years ago. So I can see this being possibly the end of the road for Lil Nog. I mean, if he wants to get back in the octagon for one last fight, I would love to see it. I would love to see possibly a fight between him and Ryan Jimmo, or possibly even, Fabio Maldonado or Jimmy Manuel. Maybe one of those three guys would love to take a fight, possible retirement fight against Lil Nog. But you know what, at 38 years old, you're out of the rankings, going forward. I don't see, a lot of progress at 38 years old. I think, it's getting close for him to wrapping up and, continuing his success to work with the much younger talent. A very respectful coach, an excellent family. He's working, he's glad to have, a gym down there in Brazil, and is able to work with the much, rising talent going into mixed martial arts. So let me hear your guys' opinion about this. Anthony Johnson defeats Antonio Rogério Nogueira via a 44-second knockout. What's next for Lil Nog? Do you think Anthony Johnson versus Glover Teixeira could be in the works for a possible fight in December? Let me hear your guys' opinion about this. I'm Justin Godsey for Justin Godsey TV. I'll catch you guys in my next video.